In the summer of 1942, the British Army held a formal review of its own tank, not to celebrate it, to decide whether to destroy it. The Churchill infantry tank had been in production for more than a year. Thousands of man-hours, 14 factories across the Midlands and the North, a vehicle that was supposed to be the backbone of British armored warfare. The Army's internal assessment that summer ran to 43 pages and listed 362 separate mechanical defects, not combat damage, factory faults, electrical failures, gearbox failures, track failures so routine that crews began carrying spare parts as standard kit, the same way they carried rations. The committee's recommendation was straightforward: halt production, scrap the design, and redirect the manufacturing capacity to something else. It didn't happen, and what did happen instead is the part nobody talks about. To understand why Britain built the Churchill at all, you have to understand what British military planners believed the next war would look like. In 1939, the dominant assumption inside the War Office was that the Western Front had not been an aberration. It was a template. The next major conflict against Germany would involve entrenched positions, prepared defenses, and infantry advancing across contested ground. The tank's job was not to exploit breakthroughs at speed. That was cavalry thinking, and cavalry thinking had gotten men killed at the Somme. The tank's job was to accompany infantry, absorb fire, and cross obstacles. That specification produced a vehicle optimized for survival, not mobility. Heavy armor, low speed, maximum obstacle crossing ability. The design contract went to Vauxhall Motors in June 1939. Vauxhall built cars. They had no experience with military vehicles at scale. The project lead, a Vauxhall engineer named Henry Spurrier, had exactly 14 months to produce a working tank from a blank sheet. Then Dunkirk happened. The British Army left 68,000 vehicles behind them on the beaches of France in May and June of 1940. Among them, virtually the entire existing armored reserve. The country that was about to go into full wartime tank production had just watched its last tanks burn on a French beach. The pressure became existential. Churchill, the vehicle, named after the Prime Minister, was ordered into production in June 1941 before the design was proven, before extended trials, before the factory tooling was fully calibrated. The Army needed a tank. Vauxhall had a design. Neither party was entirely certain it would work. The conventional approach to tank design in 1940 involved a hull, a turret, a power plant, and a running gear, in that order of complexity. The Churchill's designers kept the hull. They modified everything else. Start with the running gear. A standard tank of the period used a suspension system with a relatively small number of large road wheels. The Germans used interleaved torsion bar arrangements on the Panzer III and IV that gave good countryside speed but added mechanical complexity. The Churchill went the opposite direction: 11 small road wheels per side, each independently sprung on a coil spring system derived from an earlier British design called the Merritt-Brown. The logic was sound. More contact points meant more even weight distribution, which meant better traction on soft ground and rubble. A tank designed to cross obstacle-strewn battlefields needed to stay in contact with whatever it was climbing over. The tracks were correspondingly wide, 356 millimeters. For reference, the Panzer IV ran on 400-millimeter tracks in its later variants, but the Churchill's ground pressure, the weight per square centimeter of track in contact with the surface, was actually lower because the vehicle spread its weight across more contact area. The armor was the honest part of the specification. The Churchill Mark I carried 102 millimeters of frontal armor. That was not exceptional by late war standards, but in 1941, it meant the vehicle was essentially proof against every German anti-tank weapon then in service at combat ranges. The trade-off was weight. The Mark I came in at 38.5 tons. For comparison, the Tiger I, the tank that would later define German heavy armor, weighed 56 tons, but that was 3 years later and a generation of engineering ahead. The engine was where the problems began. Vauxhall fitted the Churchill with a Bedford Twin 6, essentially 2 commercial truck engines joined at a common crankshaft to produce a single 350 horsepower unit. It worked in the sense that it produced usable power. It also occupied nearly the entire rear third of the hull, required an elaborate cooling system that was sensitive to dust and debris, and shared lubrication circuits in ways that meant a minor failure in one block could cascade to the other. In a factory-controlled environment, the Bedford Twin 6 performed to specification. In field conditions, mud, temperature variation, sustained high-load operation, it revealed itself as a vehicle designed by engineers who had not spent much time in North Africa or Russia. The gearbox was worse. The Merritt-Brown gearbox was, in theory, an advanced design, one of the first true regenerative steering systems on a British tank, allowing the driver to steer by controlling power to each track, rather than simply braking one side. In practice, the tolerances required for it to function correctly were tighter than the factories producing it could reliably hold. By late 1941, training crews were reporting gearbox seizures after fewer than 100 miles. The Army knew. Production continued. That was the flaw. The failure was something entirely else. The first major deployment of the Churchill tank was Operation Jubilee, August 19, 1942, the raid on Dieppe. 27 Churchills landed on the beaches of Dieppe that morning. They were the first tanks ever committed to a major amphibious assault on a defended European coastline. The operation was a disaster that has been extensively documented, usually through the lens of the Canadian infantry battalions who made up the majority of the raiding force. Of the 6,086 men who crossed the Channel, 3,632 were killed, wounded, or captured before the operation was officially abandoned. The Churchill's performance at Dieppe is less often examined. Of the 27 tanks that landed, 12 failed to cross the beach at all, not from enemy fire, from the shingle. The smooth, fist-sized stones of the Dieppe beach defeated the Churchill's tracks in a way that no test program had anticipated, because no test program had tested it on that specific surface. The remaining 15 reached the seawall. None crossed it. The only exits from the beach were defended. The tanks that were not disabled by mechanical failure were abandoned at the wire or destroyed to prevent capture. The after-action report filed by the 14th Canadian Army Tank Regiment did not describe mechanical failure as the primary cause. The tactics were wrong, the intelligence was incomplete, the exit points were never viable. All of this is true. It is also true that 12 tanks failed mechanically before they reached the enemy. The War Office response was not to delay, it was not to redesign, it was to commission a review. The same review that would produce the 43 pages and 362 defects and simultaneously accelerate production while the review was ongoing. The logic was that a war being fought in 1942 could not pause for a tank that might be fixed in 1944. The engineers at Vauxhall understood this. What they could not force into the bureaucratic record was the extent to which the factories producing Churchill components were operating beyond their quality control capability. The Merritt-Brown gearbox required machining tolerances that the subcontractors filling War Office contracts could not consistently meet. The specifications said one thing, the delivered parts were something else. Inspection failed to catch the gap because the inspection regime was calibrated to a manufacturing standard that no longer matched what was actually happening on the shop floor. The people who knew this wrote memos. The memos went to committees. The committees produced recommendations. The recommendations became policy about 6 months after the relevant production run had already shipped. The Churchill Mark III, introduced in 1942, fixed the most obvious problems with the earlier marks. The Mark IV fixed more. By the time the Mark VII appeared in 1944, with 152 millimeters of frontal armor and a largely resolved mechanical specification, the vehicle that had almost been cancelled was arguably the best armored British tank in service. The Army had not decided to fix the Churchill because it understood the problem. It had fixed the Churchill because the war kept going long enough for the factories to catch up to the specification that should have been met in 1941. Nobody issued a press release about that. No one named the decision that chose production speed over readiness. The record reflects what worked. It is quieter about the period before that. The Churchill Tank fought at Tunisia in 1943, where its armor proved decisive against German anti-tank guns in terrain that would have stopped lighter vehicles entirely. It fought at Anzio. It fought at Monte Cassino. It crossed the Rhine. At D-Day, on the 6th of June 1944, Churchill AVREs, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, variants fitted with specialist assault equipment, were among the first armored vehicles on the beaches. They cleared obstacles, they bridged seawall drops, they enabled the infantry advance in conditions that would have destroyed their predecessors. The same vehicle that a War Office committee had voted to cancel 2 years earlier was, at that moment, doing exactly what it had been designed to do in 1939. Some of what survives is on display at Bovington Tank Museum in Dorset. There are 6 in the collection, spanning multiple marks. The Mark I, with its hole-mounted QF 3-inch howitzer, occupying a position that most tank designers had abandoned a decade earlier. The Mark VII, with the thick slab of face-hardened armor that the 1942 committee had considered a fantasy. They are not elegant vehicles. The suspension is complex, the silhouette ungainly, the engine access panels suggest a vehicle that expected to be worked on constantly. That is, in the end, what this story is actually about. Not the 362 defects, not the 43 pages. The Churchill story is a story about what happens when an institution commits to a production schedule before a design is ready and then discovers, slowly, expensively, and across several thousand miles of actual combat, that the gap between what was promised and what was delivered can be closed if the war runs long enough to close it. It worked. That is true. It is also true that it worked despite a set of decisions that could, under certain circumstances, have made it not work at all. Subscribe if you want more of these.